What's up, ego hackers? This is season 30, episode 2. Season 30 is about hypocrisy and the many hypocrisies of the 16 types. And this is the many hypocrisies of the ESTP archetype. Fun. So yeah, decided to do this season sooner than later because a lot of people are having a hard time navigating through various virtue and vice approaches and understanding the significance or the meaning behind virtue and vice. I mean, why should we care? Why does it matter? And I think it's necessary to show from a virtue and vice standpoint how exactly the 16 types can behave, but behave in, like, I guess more concretely or practically. So yeah, practical application for virtue and vice. And it really, comes in the form of hypocrisy. Now, granted, every single one of the 16 types has various hypocrisy or hypocrisies. Everyone just kind of has to know what everyone else and what themselves are capable of. And I think this is especially important of ESTPs because with TI parent, they also lack introverted sensing. And because of how external they are with extroverted feeling instead of introverted feeling and the like, that can be a problem. A huge problem. Big problem. Because they're TI parents. And what do TI parents have in common? Well, insincerity. And ESTPs are, they're very good at lying to themselves, very good at seducing themselves or convincing themselves of things that aren't true because they're not willing to talk about it, or they usually just blow it off as, I'm just not aware of this, so it's not really my responsibility, or it's not really going to bother me. And given that they're FU child, they have this thing where FU child likes to bury their emotions, bury their feelings, but it's all about burying shame. And getting an ESTP to open up about their feelings, especially things that they are ashamed of, is especially difficult. It's to the point where they even lie to themselves saying that, I shouldn't talk about my feelings because I don't want to burden other people with my feelings. Which, let's be honest, is really hypocritical of ESTPs because not only are they unaware of the consequences of their actions, they actually don't give a flying fuck about the consequences of their actions. And even though they're all about my choice, what I want, and no one's going to take away my choice because if they do, I'm going to get violent and immediately violent. Don't take away my freedom, etc. Well, they're anti-inferior because of that fear of freedom. They often have to prove to themselves and to everybody else that they're strong enough to make that choice. Even if that choice harms other people, even if that choice creates burdens for other people. This is one of the areas with which ESTPs are hypocritical because they are often unaware of how much burden they cause on other people with their own freedom of choice. And this includes choosing to not talk about their feelings, for example, their FI trickster feelings. Feelings that are actually there, but they ignore, and it turns them into this ticking time bomb of a powder keg of a person that will ultimately explode. And because they are making the choice to bury their shame instead of share their shame, that shame will create a shame bomb inside of themselves, and that choice will lead to a shame bomb that will explode, which will create burdens for other people. On top of alienating people, on top of pushing other people away. And this is one of the reasons why ESTPs go out of the way to perform loyalty checks towards other people. Because from their point of view, if someone's not strong enough to stick around and take the burden of an ESTP's freedom, then that person is really just a fair-weathered friend. But the reality of the situation is that it's just the ESTP is lying to themselves and trying to convince themselves that, hey, since I go out of my way to be perfect, like an INFJ subconscious would want me to, I can then covert contract through my FE child onto other people that I expect them to be perfect, and I expect them to be able to handle the burden of my freedom of choice, which is absolutely ridiculous. And not only do they have a lack of awareness of consequences, but they are actually actively choosing to not be aware of consequences of their own choice. And we talk a lot about this regarding the NE demon in the last premium lecture series. I think NE demon is episode 2 of that lecture series, How to Master Your Demon. And ESTPs just have to realize that, hey, this is one of the reasons why I'm undesirable as an ESTP. And in order for me to be more desirable to people in my life, I should probably be willing to share my shame. But again, it's like, oh, I feel guilty for sharing my shame because it's not someone else's problem, or I don't want to create burdens, even though, hypocritically speaking, their freedom of choice creates burdens for people all the time. For example, ESTPs have this problem where, like when they go shopping, they either absolutely underbuy, meaning if they're going to buy food, for example, they'll only buy for themselves and not think about anyone else because they're being thoughtless. Or they'll buy too much, and then it ends up turning into something that's completely wasteful. And ESTPs are insanely wasteful. Every ESTP in my life, I'd probably say the ESTP archetype in general is probably the most wasteful of all the types. And often, when you give them the ability to make those choices, or if they're just going to make those choices on their own, it's going to lead to more burdens. And everyone else around them is just going to have to clean up their mess. This is one of the reasons why ESTPs, for example, shy away from people after a while. Like, for example, say in my marriage, my wife messes up big time. Big, huge fuck up on her part. And instead of actually trying to fix the situation, she devalues herself so much with her guilt and her shame in that situation that she actually just leaves. She just runs, and she runs away. And it's funny because it's another hypocrisy of an ESTP. The ESTP expects everyone else around them to be strong and be able to tolerate their freedom of choice and tolerate and be able to handle the burdens of their freedom of choice. But they themselves are not willing to handle the burdens of their freedom of choice. Now, granted, they may say they can handle it, but their actions don't always match their words. And they end up running. And the archetype of the person that runs away from their problems, and sure, ISTPs do this as well, but ESTPs especially do this. Because they also realize that the burdens or blowback or negative consequences that they've created with their freedom of choice will actually come back to haunt them and actually take away their freedom. So they're also running so that they can preserve their freedom. An example of this can actually be seen by the ESTP known as Robbie, a character in a very popular show called Cobra Kai, which is based on, the Karate Kid universe. And Robbie is the son of, Mr. Lawrence, Johnny Lawrence, who lost to Daniel LaRusso in the All Valley Karate Tournament in the first Karate Kid film. And he lost. But Robbie is the ESTP son of Johnny Lawrence, who is the ESTJ father. He's also the protagonist of the show. And Robbie ends up, hashtag spoilers, here it is, ends up in a showdown with a rival from a rival dojo. They get into a fight at school, and he ends up kicking this kid over the ledge, and this kid becomes paralyzed. And instead of standing there and taking responsibility for his actions, oh look, another hypocrisy where ESTPs expect everybody else to take responsibility for their actions, but they're the last person in the room to take responsibility for their own actions. Then the ESTP hightails it and runs from their problems instead of actually fixing it. I've even criticized my own wife, telling her, like, look, it's nice that you make it look like, your ISTJ shadow makes it look like that, oh, if I just stay around, I'm just going to make it worse. When the reality of the situation is, you're just protecting yourself, you're just protecting your freedom of choice, and you're just running away from your problems, when you should stay here in the trenches and actually fix the problem instead of running away from your problem and expecting everybody else in your life to fix your problem that your freedom caused. This is why ESTPs often end up in jail, or some form of jail, or some form of their freedom being taken away, because they are often irresponsible about how to use that freedom, that power of freedom that NI inferior and ultimately NI aspirational has been given to them. But again, they like to run away. They like to run away. And it's hard. It's hard for them to even admit that they did anything wrong. They really have a hard time admitting that. Because if they admit it, that means they have to take action. If they admit it, that means they will have to stop their own freedom of choice and use that time, sometime, to actually fix the problem that they caused. And many ESTPs out there, especially the more immature ones, are just unwilling to do this. This is how an ESTP can be entitled. Oh look, another hypocrisy of the ESTP, where the ESTP has ENFP superego, and they absolutely cannot stand anything that looks like an ENFP or looks being depraved or looks being entitled. And they go out of their way to destroy entitlement, even more so than destroy weakness, whereas the ENFP has both. It has both entitlement and weakness at the same time. And that ESTP is out to destroy that form of bad character. Yet, it's the ESTP, when they are lacking integrity and no one's looking, they are the most entitled. They are the weakest, the most fragile. So when they're out in the world putting on a show, it's usually a show of strength, but it doesn't mean there is actually any strength of character there. It doesn't mean they actually have any integrity. That's another hypocrisy of an ESTP. And ESTPs really struggle. They struggle with these issues. They often find themselves being a master to an apprentice with their INFJ subconscious. But they can end up taking it too far with the apprentice, so that the apprentice leaves with a lot of the ESTP fragility and bad habits. And the ESTP ends up having this perspective of, power and strength before character, when the INFJ subconscious's job is there to teach character and not necessarily power and strength, because power and strength is not always a pathway to good character. Yet the ESTP is part of the soul temple, and the soul temple is all about having good character and keeping others in a form of good character and having good character themselves. It's very important. But they often don't make it a priority, and that could be a problem. So that's why, ESTPs are often in fight or flight mode in their life. And this is why ESTPs are often some of the most abusive of all of the types, because of being in that constant fight or flight mode. But how do they get out of fight or flight mode? There's really only one way, and that really is self-humiliation. If an ESTP can get to the point where they can admit to themselves that they're not actually better than anyone else, that they're not actually smarter than everybody else, that they are just as fragile, if not more fragile than everybody else. It's kind of like the bully on the playground that beats the other kids on the playground because his daddy beats him at home. My microphone went out there for a second. But it's, like I said, it's like when the ESTP bully on the playground who beats the other kids is only doing it because his daddy beats him at home or his mommy beats him at home. Yes, that's a thing, folks. Not just trying to be all gender equality. That's a thing. So that can create a lot of issues. And, no one understands making your misery your ministry more than an ESTP. Because what they mirror at home, they mirror everywhere else in their life. And I'll be honest, I love my wife, but she can be extremely cruel. She can be abusive. Why, though? Well, guess what? Her father, a fellow Templar, she mirrored him her entire upbringing. And he is the cruelest man I have ever met. He is extremely abusive person. Why is that? Because he mirrored his INTJ mother, who was also extremely abusive and cruel, very cruel woman. The stories I hear about my wife's grandmother are honestly terrifying. To the point where in one particular case, an animal who was a pet of my wife's father was actually killed right in front of him by his mother to make a point to him, which is pretty crazy if you think about it. So I'm not here to sit in judgment over my wife or sit in judgment over her father or even in judgment of her mother. I can only imagine what kind of suffering her INTJ grandmother had to go through, given that, she started out in a samurai family who cared about Bushido, but for some reason she ended up on a stripper pole and was a call girl, which is ultimately how my wife's ENTP grandfather met that INTJ, and then he later married her, but she was actually a call girl. And to get back at his mother, my wife's ENFJ father exposed that fact at her funeral in front of everybody. Pretty crazy, huh? It's kind of interesting, the family dynamics you marry into, etc. So again, I'm not here to sit in judgment of these people. I'm here to show you the problems and how the problems go back generation upon generation. And it's especially difficult for Templars. It's especially difficult for ESTPs because ESTPs and INFJs mirror people the most. They're all about mirroring. And she's mirrored that cruelty. He's mirrored that cruelty. And that SI demon bitterness and the INTJ grandmother. Gosh, who knows what happened to that. But it's been serious and a major problem. Throughout their family history, etc. And in all cases, or most cases, these people ended up dying alone. Not something I want for my wife. Honestly, not something I want for her dad either, if he would take the time to humble himself. But in his family, strength has been, or at least shows of strength, has been the priority instead of actually being a person of good character. Because they conflate strength with character. Because it's so easy for immature ESTPs or immature Templar types, for example, to assume that, hey, if someone is weak, that means they lack character. And oftentimes, SI users, especially NP types like myself, are victimized by Templars or ESTPs who have that mindset that if you look weak or if you are weak, that must mean that you lack character. This too is another hypocrisy of an ESTP personality archetype. They just suck in that area. And it's so funny to watch them pride themselves as these amazing judges of character when they often themselves lack good character. It's like they don't even understand character. And it's so funny, they're part of the Soul Temple, and the Soul Temple is about having the best character ever, but their FI trickster doesn't know a damn thing about being human or having good character. And the only way an ESTP would have good character is if they surround themselves with people of good character. That would have to be, for example, philosopher types who have suffered greatly in their life, yet still remain good people regardless of their suffering. That would be, in my opinion, the ideal of what an ESTP should be surrounding themselves with, so that their own personal character can increase, so that they can mirror the right people or mirror healthy people. And let me tell you, folks, it's been really hard within my own marriage for my wife to be mirroring a fellow FI trickster. Thank God I'm shadow focused, because as a result of being shadow focused psychologically, I am able to produce some introverted feeling morality with which she can latch on and actually somewhat develop her character. But I will admit, it's not enough. It's really not enough. It's a good thing that our son is an FI child. And an FI child would be more than enough FI for her FE child to lock on to also further develop her character. But this is an example as to why, for example, like with people, that, you can't do it on your own. You really can't. And as pragmatic as an ESTP would claim to be, or try to put on the show of being pragmatic and super independent, they are not. They are actually insanely dependent, because they are trying to get closer and closer and ultimately become their INFJ subconscious in its aspirational form, which is affiliative. ISTPs are very similar. The other SPs, ESFP and ISFP, don't do this. They actually just become even more pragmatic. But not the STPs, and certainly not the ESTP with that FE parent inside of the INFJ subconscious going out of their way. Going out of their way to be affiliative, then they end up becoming more and more dependent as they explore more and more of their own character and develop their own character. They have to do this. If they don't, they will essentially remain immature and thus remain abusive. Here's another issue. While they're on that journey, oftentimes when you're talking to ESTPs, and I heard this from my ESTP mentor all the time, and he was very abusive towards me. When I woke him up one time, and he woke up in a huge rage, because how dare I take away his choice as to when he should wake up. The thing is, though, is that I had to, because we were late and we didn't have much of a choice, and he was being irresponsible. And then he blamed me for it, even though it was actually his irresponsibility that led to that point. Because they're so tactical, and it's so funny because, like I said, they expect everyone else to be responsible, but they themselves are not. And it takes them an entire lifetime to figure out how to be responsible. I mean, sure, they're the most masculine of all the types, they're the most alpha of all the types. This is why, as they get older, they become more beta and exhibit more beta traits, because that's how they learn how to become more responsible, is exhibiting those and practicing those beta traits, where they realize that shows of strength does not actually mean strength, but true strength actually comes as a result of strength of character. But, they're not going to understand such an abstract thought without their subconscious more developed, because their subconscious itself is actually more abstract. And then they're becoming more and more affiliative over time. And they'll shed that pragmatism such that they will become more balanced between the affiliative and the pragmatic, which will help. The problem is how much damage will they do to other people while learning to get there? How much alienation will happen to other people while the ESTP is going through this growing process? It can be insanely damaging. And that's the thing, ESTPs often arrogantly believe that anything that they break, they can fix. Wrong. There's something called FUBAR, which means fucked up beyond all repair, which means it's possible an ESTP could break something or hurt something such that it is irreparable. But they often see themselves as the person who can fix anything they break. This is not true. Another hypocrisy on their part. And then here's another one. Standards. My ESTP mentor would always tell me, you make the rules, you make the rules. And he would ask me what I think. And I would say a response. And even though he disagreed with me at that moment, and he knew I was wrong, he set me up for failure. It's funny because ESTPs hate being set up for failure. Well, guess what? They set people up for failure all the time. Another hypocrisy right there. So he set me up for failure. And then when my suggestion didn't work out, he came down on me so hard. And he said, well, you made the rules. You made the standard. And I'm like, wow. So you just used me. You used me, and you already knew it was wrong, but you used me and used me as your scapegoat because I created the standard which gave you license to behave poorly. Wow. And that's the thing, especially in my own marriage, my wife is constantly asking me for standards, which is what an FITE user would do. And I tell her to her face, I ain't getting you a standard. You're going to figure this out on your own. And if you fail, that's still on you. Because ESTPs like to ask for standards, knowing that the standards are bad, so that if they do fail, it's on the standard giver and not on them personally. So they are in effect setting themselves up for failure that way, so that they have the excuse to not feel ashamed for the failure or feel guilty for the failure. Another hypocrisy. It's so annoying. I hate that they do this. Don't do that, folks. Seriously, don't do it. Another hypocrisy. They have this problem where they expect everyone else to give them attention, to the point where they do good things for other people and they feel owed, like they're owed attention. They feel owed. And then they got to go collect that attention. But when it comes to giving other people attention, they don't. They don't. And they expect other people to give them attention, but are not willing themselves to give attention or willing to share. There's another one. They expect everyone else to share with them, but they won't share with anybody. It's really frustrating. And just like introverted sensors need to be taught how to share, because introverted sensors, especially small children, they don't share. That's the thing. Whereas NI users who make choices all the time and have their freedom all the time, they need to be taught how to ask before making a choice, right? So SI users need to be taught how to share, and NI users need to be taught how to ask. This is basic parenting 101. This is one of the areas with which an ESTP can be a hypocrite unless they learn how to ask, because they care about their freedom and they're so afraid of losing their freedom that they don't ask anyone for shit. And then they make the decision and it becomes a burden on everybody else, and they didn't even ask to begin with. And then they try to use standards, gaming standards with people around them so that they can blame the people for their own failure when it was actually them because they just decided to not ask to begin with. It's pretty fucked up, if you ask me. It's really fucked up. It's a huge problem. And that's another way how an ESTP can be very abusive, albeit narcissistic. Here's another thing. They expect everyone else to listen to them, but don't very much listen to other people. Now, granted, this is much worse with TI inferiors, but TE critic can really get in the way. And ESTPs really, really struggle with taking advice. And they always see themselves as the advice giver instead of the advice taker. And because of that, they end up falling behind in life. They end up falling behind literally everybody else. It's one of the reasons why later in life they're more encouraged to be more responsible, because people in their youth are a lot further along in their life and they've just been kind of left behind. And that really sucks. It really sucks for ESTPs to be in that position, because it's like, oh crap, I should be married now. I should have children right now. I should have a job now. I should know how to pay my taxes now. I should know how to pay my bills now. But they don't. And those become burdens on other people. You know, they see themselves as huge avenger against entitlement, yet they can't even fill out goddamn paperwork. They can't even pay their own taxes. They have unclaimed money. You know, they're hypocrites. They expect so much from everyone, but very much don't offer much themselves. Very hypocritical. You know, and like I was just saying, like, they need to learn how to be more responsible. They got to learn how to pay their bills. And they don't. And they fall behind in life. And everyone in their social circle, friend circle, is way further along in life than they are. And they're way behind everybody else. They don't even know how to pay their taxes. They don't even know how to fill out paperwork. They're super irresponsible with that. It's funny, I was listening to my wife last night cursing about how she has to show up on time for an event and how she's going to be judged by everyone else for not showing up on time. And I'm like, that's how the world works. Here's another hypocrisy they have. They have this thing where they expect other people to be proactive, but they aren't proactive. They are not. They don't know how to get ahead of things because they're always behind. And then when they are behind, they run away from their problems instead of facing those problems head on, so they get even more behind. And that's the problem. They always need to be bailed out. And that's why they'll either look like they're bailing out, or they'll actually bail out someone else. And they'll bail out someone else in like a small way. And then when they come to collect that bailout, that they expect that person to bail them out of something way, way worse. I actually watched this on a show called Warrior on HBO last night, where Mr. O'Leary, who is an ESTP, bailed out his cop friend, gave him some money, and then when it came time to collect that favor, he collected I counted at least 6 different favors, which are obviously worth way, way more than the little bit of money he gave that cop, and that made that cop become a dirty cop and have way less character. So this ESTP's own entitlement destroyed the character of this loyal cop that started out as a good person in the show, but now he's a horrible person in the show because the ENFP super ego just keeps taking and taking and taking and taking. And yet the ESTP is the one who's supposedly against entitlement. Yet they have become the thing that they have sworn to destroy. That's the problem, folks. That's reality. And this is how ESTPs behave every goddamn day. And they don't even realize it. They're so external and so focused on everybody else, even sometimes comparing themselves to other people on a regular basis and telling themselves and lying to themselves, saying, well, hey, at least I'm not like that person. At least I'm not that bad. And then they use that as license to continue poor behavior. Because if you ever hear the adage, well, everyone else is doing it, that's what ESTPs say. Everyone else is doing it, etc. And they give themselves this excuse. They give themselves license to behave poorly because everyone else around them is behaving poorly. Drugs, sex, alcohol, it doesn't matter. Any kind of vice, they will allow themselves to do it if other people around them do it. Yet they're the ones who expect other people to have better character than they do. Hypocrites. ESTPs are literally the purveyors of the, quote, race to the bottom behavior. It's one of the reasons, and then when you mix it in with sexuality and it gets into their nymphomania vice, this is why they allow themselves to have thousands upon thousands of sex partners, which is insane. Even though technically the INFJ statistically would have far more sex partners than the ESTP. The ESTP is so overt about it. They're so overt with their sexuality that they end up being the ones who have the bad rap. They end up being the ones for being the biggest hoes, even though technically the INFJ would be the absolute worst of the types statistically. But because they're introverted and it's more hidden, it's not as overt as the ESTP's approach to sexuality. So the ESTP ends up taking a reputation hit. And then the ESTP understands how unfair that is, and then they just, well, this is how everyone's judging me anyway, so this is how I'm going to behave. And they just use other people's judgments as an excuse for their poor behavior. Oh, look, yet another form of hypocrisy. That's just great. That's fantastic, you know. I thought you're supposed to be INFJ subconscious. I thought you're supposed to be there, you know, increasing other people's character and being a master to an apprentice or many apprentices and making them better. But instead, you're actually walking around in the world making it worse. Tell me, ESTPs, what exactly is your contribution? Because it sounds like you lack a contribution entirely. It sounds like you're not willing to grow up. You're not willing to take responsibility. You're not willing to be proactive. And proactivity is pretty easy. You can either do it from an intuitive, abstract standpoint and get ahead because you see it coming, or you could just be prepared for all eventual things. Yes, it takes a lot of work. Yes, you'll have to put in work. God forbid. So funny. They expect everyone else to not be lazy, but they themselves are really, really lazy. Especially when they're smoking dope. Oh my God. It's so ridiculous. So ridiculous. You know, but it's so hard. It's so hard to see that ENFP superego inside of them, and it's there, making them just as entitled, if not more entitled than actual ENFPs. And then they blame the ENFPs of the world for them behaving that badly instead of taking responsibility themselves. It's pretty sad, folks. It's pretty ridiculous. They don't have to be that way. They could instead have strength of character on their own, be willing to deny themselves, exercise some self-discipline, being willing to ask instead of just make the decision and force everyone else around them to deal with the consequences of their bad behavior. That would be nice. That would be appropriate. That would be necessary to make the world better, make the world a better place. But instead, they end up being the ones who create the standard or the culture and become a culture carrier of the race to the bottom. And that's not good. And that, in my opinion, folks, is the absolute worst hypocrisy of an ESTP. Do not be this way. Grow up, be mature, ask before you make decisions. You're becoming more affiliative anyway, and you are still choosing to ask. You're still exercising your freedom to ask. And if you ask, that's you having good character. Seriously, it's you having good character, just as much as it's me sharing instead of trying to keep everything for myself, right? That's when I have true character. And you can have that too, ESTPs. If you found this lecture useful, helpful, educational, enlightening, please leave a comment below. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. I hope it was very enlightening as to some of the more negative behaviors that ESTPs have. But as long as you're on the path of cognitive development, you won't have to deal with these issues as much. And you'll be growing, and you won't be relying on other people's standards, etc. And you'll be surrounding yourself with people, people of good character, and they'll actually want to be around you because you're willing to do things like ask, etc. And you're being very chaste, not just with your sexuality, but with your behavior as well. Because that means you're a person who has good enough character such that people will be willing to follow you. People will be willing to bail you out. People may even be willing to carry some of the burden you create when you exercise your freedom. People will be willing to stick around for you. And I know that's definitely what you want. Well, that's how you get to it, by not being a hypocrite and recognizing what areas of your life you are actually a hypocrite. Stop pointing out everyone else's hypocrisy when you yourself are a hypocrite. As Jesus said, stop trying to get the speck out of your brother's eye when you got a huge tree growing out of your own eye. Take care of the tree first before you point anything else on everyone else. I get that you guys are super external and some of the most external of all the types, but still, you have no excuse. Especially when you have Jesus, an INFJ, who's even more external, making that claim. So anyway, folks, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys tonight.